Hello. Hello everyone and welcome here to the Intelligence Squared Economic Outlook in partnership with Guinness Global Investors. I'm Connor, Head of Programming at Intelligence Squared, and I'm delighted to welcome you here tonight for what is the third instalment of the Intelligence Squared Economic Outlook this year. We've had Martin Wolf from the Financial Times to start us off the year. Our second event was with Keiyu Jin taking us through Asia. We've got Paul here tonight talking about the UK's domestic policy, and then to round out the year in late November we've got Tim Harford, the Financial Times undercover economist, who will be kind of rounding out the year and telling us what the big trends are to look out for in 2025. So do keep an eye on the website for that and do come along. The final thing to say is, of course, we are delighted to be working with Guinness Global Investors as part of the Economic Outlook series. And for those of you that don't know, Guinness Global Investors is an independent British fund manager that helps both individuals and institutions harness the future drivers of growth to achieve their investment goals. And with specialisms in Asia, income investing, innovation and sustainability, they offer funds for the core of any equity portfolio. So for more information on Guinness Global Investors, do just speak to your financial advisor or visit their website. That's all from me. I'm going to hand you over to your chair for this evening, so please give a warm welcome to BBC journalist and broadcaster, Johnny Diamond.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Connor. Thank you. And welcome to Intelligence Squared Economic Outlook. As Connor said, our third event. And what is delightful about doing all of these is seeing how they knit together. And there are things that Martin Wolf said that I will put to our guest, because that was before the election, and this is, of course, after it. I am delighted to be with Paul tonight. He is, as you know, the director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the UK's leading economic research institute. I think anyone who listens to the radio, watches TV, is online will recognize him. His work is from in-house podcasts to a brilliant Radio 4 series that went out in 2022, looking at the state of the nation's finances and everything in between. I should say he is almost talked out today, having done, I think, a conference this morning, a podcast this afternoon, and now this event this evening. But we will put him through the ringer one more time, discussing a fascinating moment for the British economy and for Britain's rather strained, complicated, and sometimes contradictory seeming public finances. Before I start, if we could just give a warm welcome to Paul. Paul Johnson, thank you. Let's start, if we could, with, I suppose, a big picture on the British economy. Where are we now? Almost 100 days, that horrible piece of artifice that media organisations like so much. Almost 100 days into the Labour administration. I presume the shape of the economy is not much different from what it was the day before the election. But how do you see it? How would you sum it up to that visitor from another planet or another country, at least, if they said, how is Britain's economy looking to you?
Well, I think you have to put it in context. So you can look at it over, the last 100 days or the last year or the last 20 years. And I think it's probably important to put it into that slightly longer term context, because whilst growth this year hasn't been bad, actually. First two quarters of this year have been growing at 0.5, 0.6% a quarter, so 2% a year on average. That's not bad by recent standards. Wages are growing in real terms for the first time in quite a while. Inflation's down, so in one sense it doesn't look too bad. But, and there's obviously a but here, this comes after a very, very long period of very, very poor growth. So since 2007, 2008, essentially no wage growth. We haven't seen anything like that since Napoleon was trying to invade. I mean, it's really that extraordinary, that this period since 2007 or thereabouts. Almost no productivity growth, also pretty much unprecedented. Obviously, we had a period of austerity. So the shadow of the financial crisis still looms over us. I think that's something we forget. It's a long time ago now, but that shadow still looms. And then, of course, we went through Brexit and COVID and the energy price spike. So lots of shocks hitting the economy for quite a long period of time. So you get into 2024 with the economy having done really badly for a really long period, but starting to look a little bit better in some senses. But you look at what people expect for the second half of this year, slowing down again, growth probably half what it was in the first half. And then you look forward, and then you're looking it's all very, very hazy when you look forward. Don't believe anything anyone tells you about what's going to happen to the economy. But the forecasts from the OBR are reasonably optimistic. A couple of % growth a year over the next few years. Oddly, the Bank of England, that other official forecaster, is less optimistic than that. So lots of uncertainty about where we go. Is the economy, in the sense of where it is and where it's going, in the worst position it's ever been in the way that the government would have you believe? No, not really. I mean, think back to 1974, think back to 2010. Are the public finances, which I'm sure we'll come into, in the worst position they've been? I think that is more likely to be true.
I've leapt ahead slightly so that we can hear from Paul rather than from me. There is also, as you can see, a book prominently displayed here. This is Paul's rather brilliant treatise on how Britain spends what it raises. Brilliant, I should say, not just because it's got all the material that you'll probably hear condensed tonight, but also because it is beautifully written, and it is handily and coincidentally on sale at the back, should you be interested. I cannot recommend it enough as a rather sophisticated primer for what everything is spent on and how it is all raised, which takes us to a rather important question. The second part of your sort of answer about the state of the economy is that sort of proviso. It's that but over public finances, which, as I understand your thinking to be, is a sort of unprecedented set of strains, both short, medium and long term. Can you give us what you've got on that?
How long have you got? So I think that's a nice way of putting it, an unprecedented set of strains on the public finances. What do we mean by the public finances? Well, the amount the government's borrowing, the amount that government's raising in taxes, the amount it's spending, how much it's borrowing, what the level of debt is. And when you look at, you take a snapshot of where we are today, taxes, it is true, are at their highest level as a fraction of national income they've essentially ever been. So you'd think there's lots of money out there for wonderful public services, but that's, as you will observe, not where we are. Rather, public services feel seriously underfunded. You might think, well, if there's lots of tax and doesn't appear to be much money for public services, then we must have a huge surplus. The public finances must be in a great position. But no, we've got very high debt and very significant borrowing. So you might, well, what on earth is going on? And I think actually understanding that what on earth is going on is really important to understanding where this government is. And I take this in sort of the short term and the long term. So in the short term, in other words, what's happened over the last, what's happening right now, how can it be that we've got high taxes and we don't appear to have any money? Well, three reasons for that, I think. First, poor growth. Poor growth obviously is bad for the amount of tax revenue you have because you've got a smaller economy. Second, and really important, we've got a very high level of debt and high interest rates. The result is that we're spending a fortune on debt interest payments. In fact, we're spending more on debt interest than on any public service other than the health service. So that gives you a sense of how much of the state revenues are taken up just by servicing the debt that we have. And thirdly, we've got a couple of areas where spending has really grown a lot over the last 4 or 5 years. One is the health service, which always grows over time. One actually is benefits for people with disabilities, where we've seen something like a £30 billion increase just over the last 5 years. There's double the number of people every month claiming disability benefits than was the case just 4 years ago. So that to a large extent is what explains why we're spending a lot at the moment, and yet we don't seem to be getting much for it. And that creates a real public finance problem for the Chancellor, because she says she wants to get debt falling in 5 years' time. Well, debt is high, debt interest payments are high, taxes are already high, and on current plans, which involve spending cuts, we're barely on track to get debt down over that period. And that's partly because we're spending so much on debt interest and we've got such a high level of debt to start with. And indeed, this government's in this horrible position where just to stop debt spiraling ever upwards, it's going to have to run what's called a primary surplus. That means it's going to have to take more from us than it gives back in everything other than paying those debt interest costs. And that'll be the first time in a very long time when a government has done that, and certainly the first time it's had to do that. So that's the sort of context for, as it were, the short-term context. I think there's a longer-term context here which also really matters. So taxes here are, as I said, higher than they've been in the past, but they're still not high by Western European standards. But look over the last 60 years, 70 years, actually the more remarkable thing is not that taxes are up now relative to 5 years ago. The more remarkable thing is they didn't rise for 60 years, really, up until 2019, whilst we spent more and more on the health service. I mean, more than doubled the fraction of national income going on the health service, more and more on pensions and the welfare system and the welfare state. And we managed to keep taxes down for that whole period as a fraction of national income. How did we do that? Well, partly we essentially abolished defence spending, took it down from about 8% to 2% of national income. That's a huge peace dividend. Partly we stopped building social housing, we stopped supporting nationalised industries, and then through the 2010s we had a decade of really serious austerity for the public services. So for that whole period we just about managed to squeeze things so that taxes didn't rise, and then it's squeezed out of the toothpaste tube over the last 4 or 5 years as all of these pressures have come from the long term alongside the short term pressures that I just described. And what's really hard to see is how we get taxes back down again. There's no more peace dividend, there's no more houses to stop building, there's no more austerity that you can possibly impose. So my bet is that this 3% of national income, so £75 billion rise in taxes we've had in the last 5 years, is here to stay and may well go further. So the first 50-something years of my life, we had taxes at one level. I reckon the next however many years of my life it's going to be, there'll be another significantly higher level. And of course, that's not something that anyone in politics wants to talk about.
You said taxes are already high. If I can share a personal moment with you, my girlfriend is Danish. The tax rate, if she were in Denmark, would start at 50%. It takes us to the argument that Britain wants, and it's a terrible abbreviation, a continental welfare state, but US levels of taxes. Do you have sympathy with that argument?
Yes, I think that's to a large extent exactly where we are. And taxes, as I said, they're high in the UK by UK standards, but still low by Western European standards, and particularly low by Scandinavian and French standards, for example, where they're much, much higher than they are here. So that's a societal choice, and in Denmark that buys you a much better welfare state, but it also means that you've got very high tax rates. And it's also worth being very clear about where these high taxes are coming from. Taxes on someone on average earnings, direct taxes on someone on average earnings, are lower now than they've been for 50 years. That last Tory government, and this is something that neither side absolutely will ever say, but that last Tory government really hit high earners, which makes it difficult for the new government to hit them even more. And actually, with the big cuts in national insurance contributions and the earlier increases in the income tax personal allowances on the direct tax side, it was actually remarkably generous to people on average earnings. And so the scope for squeezing more out of high earners, it's there, you can do more, but it's much less than it would have been there 10 years ago.
Let me pick you up on another thing you've just said. Neither side will ever say. It takes us to the question at the heart, perhaps, of our tax debate, which is political honesty. Martin Wolf, when he gave this talk or was in conversation a couple of sessions ago, was asked what was his advice to an incoming Labour government, and he said, forget what you just campaigned on. When you hear the perhaps internally coherent arguments about tax that parties make, do you despair of how they look at the wider and longer picture? Do you believe that they are dishonest with us? Do you believe that we are dishonest about our own desires on tax and spend?
Well, I think we are dishonest as an electorate. I think there's a big trust gap from electorate to politicians, but also from politicians to electorate, and that's why we get these ridiculous games with the tax system. So the last government implemented some very big tax rises through freezing personal allowances and national insurance thresholds and so on for a number of years. But then last year and at the beginning of this year, Jeremy Hunt capped national insurance contributions by £20 billion, knowing full well that the public finances would make that very difficult to sustain. And the Labour Party, knowing full well that if they won, they were definitely going to want that £20 billion, voted for and provided full-throated support for those cuts in national insurance contributions, and then went into the election, as you know, promising no increases in income tax rates, national insurance, VAT, and corporation tax, which between them account for 3/4 of all of our tax revenues. But they clearly felt that's what they needed to say in order to get elected. And that leaves them a very big problem in terms of the problems with the public finances that I've just described, that if they're really not going to raise those taxes, then they're going to have some combination of breaking what they also put in their manifesto about the fiscal targets they were going to meet, or some very tight spending plans. And if we're going to, it's obvious, if we want better public services, if we want to spend more money on pensions and welfare and the NHS and so on, then in the long run we're going to have to accept higher taxes. And the important point there is we. This is the debate about taxes always, wherever I go. Yes, we understand the need for higher taxes, but someone else can pay them. The companies, or the rich, or the people creating pollution, or what have you. And yes, of course, there's a case for all of those things. But if you compare our tax system with the tax systems in all of those countries that pay more tax than us, the big difference is that people on average incomes here pay less than people on average incomes there. Actually, companies here pay more. Astonishing, they pay more than they have ever paid as a fraction of national income. High earners here tend to pay more as well, partly because they're very high earning, but also because we have quite a progressive tax system. So you can't hide behind if you want a bigger welfare state, if we want to increase taxes by another 3% of national income, that can't all come from somebody else.
Questions are rolling in, which is delightful. As I say, we'll talk until roughly the top of the hour, and then there'll be questions from the audience here and questions online. Do keep sending them in. Thank you very much indeed. Given these sort of the pledges that are made on tax take, on what taxes Labour won't touch, how radical, how redistributive do you think the forthcoming budget could be?
I don't know. I'm really intrigued. Yeah. I've rarely been so intrigued by a budget. I mean, this is clearly going to set the agenda for the rest of this Parliament. Most importantly, in a way, it will set the spending envelope for the rest of this Parliament. So we'll find out how tight or generous the government's going to be in terms of spending on public services. We'll find out whether it is going to keep to the letter and the spirit of all of those promises made in the manifesto. If it does keep to the letter and spirit of those promises, and it wants to raise revenue, then it's going to, where can it look? And the answer is there are not very many big revenue raisers that it hasn't ruled out. So here are some things it could do, and I am absolutely not saying that I think it should do these things. If they want one big way of raising revenue that they haven't ruled out, then restricting tax relief on pension contributions is easily the biggest and to some extent easiest. Now, I don't think that's a good idea, and it will be very difficult, particularly with public sector workers, many of whom are at or close to higher rate tax. It's also technically difficult. But that's the big number, 15 billion, something like that. Most of the other things that you can think of are a small number of billions. So people have talked lots about reforming capital gains tax. My goodness, it needs reforming. There is not lots of money there, small number of billions, and you have to be super careful about how you do it to avoid creating chaos, frankly, which has continually happened with changes to capital gains tax. There's a small number of billions, potentially from closing some of the loopholes in inheritance tax. You can change VAT thresholds. You can, you certainly should adjust council tax so that people living around here don't pay absurdly small amounts relative to the value of their property. That's going to make me popular, isn't it? But we are in this mad world where a £5 million house in Westminster pays the same council tax as a 3-bedroom semi in Blackpool. It's just indefensible. So you could do something at the top of the council tax band, which actually they are doing in Wales. But none of these things, right, apart from a raid on pensions, none of these things that I can see raise lots of money. Now, you could break the spirit of the promise by reintroducing the old health and social care levy that Rishi Sunak introduced when he was Chancellor. That's the one thing that the Liz Truss budget abolished, which has remained abolished. That would be breaking clearly the spirit of the promise not to increase these taxes, but perhaps not the absolute letter. That gets you significant amounts of money. But I find it really genuinely hard. And I'll be that's why I'm so intrigued by what we'll see in the budget, to see how you really make big changes to tax revenue without breaking some of those election promises, either in letter or in spirit.
In a moment, I want to talk about your views on growth, if we could, because it's a key part of refinancing the public sector in the medium term and the long term for the Labour government. I'm intrigued by these various different third rails to important Americanism that there are now with British fiscal policy. We have all the taxes which every party now pledges it won't touch. You have the really rather important triple lock on pensions, which the parties ritually say they won't touch. You have council tax, which you bravely suggest that they might try reforming, as local government finance always brings central government joy. There is a popular idea knocking around that the country has become somewhat sclerotic, that it is too rigidly held within its sets of beliefs and political constraints. Do you feel that? Do you think that this accretion of pledges and promises and things you can't touch make reform very difficult in the UK?
I think there is a degree of, there's all sorts of sclerosis when you look at it. Maybe we'll come on to the things like the planning system, how difficult it is to build things later, but that is a form of regulatory sclerosis and political sclerosis. I think this difficulty of being honest about tax, as we've described. I think there's sclerosis about any kind of sensible debate about the National Health Service, where how much should we be spending on it? Does it have to be entirely publicly delivered? How should it be organised? It is much the biggest thing the state does, and yet any kind of serious debate is kind of closed down, despite the fact that most people who use it find it awful. We all say in principle, there's lots of fantastic evidence of polling. Everyone asks about the NHS. In principle, in theory, they say it's the most thing I'm most proud of. And then when they're asked about their experience of it, it tends to be less good. So I think there's sclerosis around that. Around pensions, it's very, very striking. First thing Rachel Reeves did, two things she said in July. One was get rid of the £200 winter fuel allowance for pensioners not on means-tested benefits. The world has sort of caved in as far as the people in the Treasury working on this are concerned. I talked to one of them recently who said that they spent that their entire summer has been working on this because the political pressure has been so extraordinary. This is a tiny change. I don't understate the impact this will have on pensioners on relatively small incomes, but it really is a small change. It's also worth saying that it's been £200 in cash terms for the last 25 years, and I didn't hear anybody complain about the fact that it's been halved in real terms over that period, which tells you again something about politics. It'd be much easier to have left it, and in 20 years' time, it would be seen as the £10 Christmas bonus is now seen. The £10 Christmas bonus, I think, was introduced in 1974. At that point, it was equal to the full weekly state pension, and it's been kept at £10 ever since, because it's much too scary to get rid of. And maybe that was the political lesson that Rachel Reeves should have learned. But actually, she announced something much, much bigger in July, which has got her no opprobrium at all, and really should have done. She just binned social care reform again. We've been waiting for so long for reform to social care, Back in 2021, was it, the Conservative government agreed to, legislated for change, which would cap the amount that people had to pay, and a number of other sensible reforms to social care. That's what the Health and Social Care Levy was supposed to pay for. Then they kicked the actual change past the election. And in July, in one sentence, Rachel Reeves said, despite the fact that Wes Streeting had said in the election campaign, we will honour this, she said, no, gone. And you kind of think, actually, there's total sclerosis about reforming and making decent that part of the welfare state. But we focus on that very easy to understand £200 and ignore this kind of extraordinary rowing back from any sensible change to the social care system.
Let's talk about growth, because with a bit of luck, there may be some growth, and it may be something that the government assists rather than gets in the way of.
That'd be nice.
Do you understand how the Labour government intends to accelerate growth in this country?
Not really, but to be fair, it is early days, and I think it's very unfair to rush to judgment. I mean, they've only just got in.
They have had 14 years in opposition to think up some policies.
Yeah, but I mean, to be fair, most of those years were slightly different to more recent years in terms of the policies they were thinking up. There is no, I don't think there's any kind of bit of the 2019 Labour manifesto and the 2024 manifesto that are vaguely similar. So it's uncharacteristically fair of me to say that it's, let's be patient. But look, there are some elements where it's clear where they're going, and there are some elements where it's not. Coming back to what I was saying about planning, they have made a lot of the need to change the planning system and build a lot more houses and make it easier to build energy infrastructure, reservoirs, and all of those kinds of things. And I'm pretty confident that one of the problems we faced in terms of growth in this country is just really hard and really expensive to build stuff. In particular, to build houses in London and the southeast, but also to build energy infrastructure, reservoirs, and all these other sorts of things. Now, it's I think one of the most positive political speeches I heard, or political passages I heard, was in Keir Starmer's speech at Labour conference last week, where he was clear that there are trade-offs here. He basically said that we are going to build pylons if your back garden like it or not, because that's important for growth. And essentially, in my view, on that and so many other things, we have chosen, because there are always trade-offs here, we've always chosen the trade-off which is anti-growth. So we've chosen to have incredibly restrictive planning rules. We've chosen not to invest in infrastructure. We've chosen not to be in the single market or customs union. We've chosen not to appropriately reform the tax system. We've chosen not to invest in education. Now, we know all of those things are what matter for growth, and on each occasion we've chosen not to, because there is a cost of choosing to do so. So I think part of it I'm very encouraged by. Part of it we have the beginnings of an outline, so a national wealth fund. I mean, we don't know what this national wealth fund is going to be. It's going to be very small, but I think the idea is to try and get some more investment going. Rachel Reeves talked a lot about investment, and I think we will see in the budget some changes to the way that debt is defined to allow that to work within our fiscal rules, and we'll probably get a bit more public investment. Now, that's helpful, but it's not going to be, I don't think, on a huge scale. But the most important thing is to get it right. And we've invested, what is it now, 60 billion in HS2, and it's been a complete catastrophe. So it actually needs to invest. It's not just their money, it also needs to be invested well. But no sign, again, hopelessly early days. Is there going to be the sort of tax reform that's needed? Doubt it. Very clear we're not going to re-enter the customs union, which we know will be good for growth. Are we really going to get significant investment in infrastructure? I don't know. And then the last thing I'd say is the government has made a lot of the of green growth, of the idea that you can get the economy growing by decarbonising, and that really, really worries me. It doesn't worry me because I think either growth is a problem or that net zero is a problem. I was on the climate change committee for a decade. It worries me that they are claiming, and I think they may even believe, that the two things are the same. And they're not the same, they are different. And if you try and put the two together and claim they're the same, there's a chance you'll fail to achieve either.
Are you saying sort of green growth is an oxymoron? It's a contradiction in terms, or they're just separate things that you might, if you're lucky, get to put together at various points?
I'm saying that maximising growth and maximising your route to net zero are two different things. And if you want to maximise growth, then you're, diminishing the net zero thing. And if you want to maximise getting to net zero, you're diminishing the growth thing.
It is, if not zero sum, then a very clear trade-off, rather than something that the two things help each other chunter along, as has been presented.
It's a trade-off, and I think what worries me is I think they believe the rhetoric that the two things are the same, because they're clearly not.
In honour of a certain former Prime Minister who is hawking his memoirs at the moment, let me ask you about your sort of, the more emotional side. Are you a gloomster and a doomster when it comes to Britain's economic future?
I'm sure I am in the view of that particular former Prime Minister.
Right.
I'm not sure that I am, actually. I think, in a very sort of uneconomic way, if you see what I mean. I think we have, if you look, we are only just, I think, coming out of the shadow of the financial crisis. As I said, that's a long time ago. But, we've only just got away from zero interest rates. We've only just, actually kind of the banking system and so on is just getting back to normal. A lot of the hit from Brexit has happened. We've got through COVID. We've got through the energy price crisis. If, this is a big if, particularly given what's happening in the world today, if we get through the next decade without any additional massive negative shocks, then it seems to be at least plausible that we'll get a reasonable or more reasonable degree of growth and income growth over this period. Interest rates are not going to be, I shouldn't say this so definitely, it's unlikely that interest rates are going to go back down to zero, probably going to stabilise, I don't know, in the 3.5% area. That's much better for economic growth than having interest rates at zero. So I think there are reasons to hope. To some extent, I think this government might start to get a bit lucky in terms of the way that the external factors are hitting it, and might make the sorts of reforms that we've been talking about on planning, for example, which will make a difference. But we're not really going to know that for some considerable period. One of the things that is frustrating about so much debate about the economy is it's always, what's growth this month? What's growth this quarter? What can the government do next month? And the answer is these are much longer term things, and particularly in terms of what governments can do. Governments can impact growth, but they can't impact growth sustainably this year. They can impact growth sustainably in 5 or 10 years' time.
Can I ask you about the sort of big three long-term trends over public finances, or three that have been identified, and that's defence and defence costs. You mentioned the premium that we rather enjoyed in the last couple of decades, demographics and climate change, and the cost of those, and how much they set alarm bells ringing individually for you.
Well, I think you've picked out the things that mean that, as I said, this current high by historic standards level of tax is not going to go down, and it's probably going to go up over the next 20 or 30 years. So defence spending came down, I think it hit 10% of national income during the Korean War at the beginning of the 1950s. It's come all the way down gradually over time to 2% of national income. So in terms of billions of pounds, that's 150 billion pounds of savings in today's terms relative to what we might have been spending. And that, as I say, has been a significant part of what's funded the growth of the welfare state. It's clearly not going to come down any further. It's clearly going to stay at least 2% of national income. Labour have promised they will get it up at some undefined date to 2.5% of national income. So that's going to grow, if anything. So that no longer exists as a cash cow and may actually be a cash negative. Climate change, we will need to spend most of the costs of mitigating climate change actually don't come from government. They come from the consumer and they come from industry. So think of the two big things that have happened in the last 10, 15 years. Gone a long way to decarbonising the electricity sector. Not a penny really of government money into that. That's all on our bills, effectively. and electric cars. Some subsidy from government, but mostly that's investment from the car industry. So a lot of what you can do in terms of what's happened in terms of mitigating climate change has not really hit the government balance sheet directly, at least. But there is one big thing. There's lots that needs doing. One big thing that's going to need doing over the next 20 years, and that's going to mean, if we're seriously going to get to net zero, we're not going to have any gas boilers in 25 years' time. That is a huge change, and that is not going to happen without significant public money and a phenomenal rollout of change, which is going to be really hard to achieve. So that's, the Climate Change Committee reckons we're looking at, I can't remember the numbers, something like 20 billion a year of public sector investment to mitigate climate change over this period, which is substantial, but it's not ridiculous by any means. Actually, bizarrely, the biggest fiscal cost may be that we stop getting any petrol taxes because we're not going to have any petrol cars. And the answer there is clearly you need to find a more sensible way of taxing electric cars. Now, the big thing then is the demographics. Yeah. It's sort of the demographics. So the population is, as you know, aging in the sense that a bigger fraction of the population is over 60 and will be over 70 and over 80 and so on in the future than is the case now. And we will really start to feel this in the next 20 or 30 years, particularly as the number of people at older ages, over 80, over 90, grows very, very fast. That will, to some extent, increase spending on pensions. That depends how quickly the state pension age rises and whether we keep with the triple lock, but that could easily add another 2 or 3% of national income to spending, but it does make a big difference whether you have the triple lock and whether you increase pension age with longevity. The big change actually is the amount we spend on health, which has already risen from about a quarter to about 40% of public service spending over this century, so since the year 2000. And that will continue on an ever upward path, as it has in every country everywhere. And that will take more and more, at least another % of national income, at least, every decade, probably more. And again, that needs to be paid for. We have choices here, but actually, there's not much point getting richer if we don't have a health service that's going to keep us healthy and alive. So I don't think it's unreasonable to say we'll want to spend more on health. And it's not just to do with aging, that's also to do with the cost of technology and the demands, the ever-increasing demands, and the ever-increasing ability of the health system to keep us healthy.
The issue of demographics does take one very neatly to something which I know you've talked about a lot, and you did it quite a lot in your Radio 4 series in 2022, and that was the idea of intergenerational inequality. And again, we talk about spending on pensions and spending on the health service, which lean towards certainly older members of the population and increased, steadily higher taxes, perhaps, which will lean much more heavily on younger people. It's a concern of yours, isn't it? Is there any way round it, given the shape of the British population and the way that taxes and spending work?
Well, there's a lot in that. I mean, if you look just at the sort of way that taxes and spending work, I mean, one way you might think about it is, can you get more money out of the older generation once they are older? Because they are also, this is a really important part of it, they own a very high fraction of the wealth. Now, you'd expect that. I mean, obviously, the average 20-year-old isn't going to have much wealth because they haven't had a chance to earn anything or save anything. And the average 65-year-old, you expect to have quite a lot of wealth because they need some money to live on in retirement. So it's not surprising. But that's become much more skewed over time. So, again, council tax, inheritance tax, ways of taxing pensions in payment are the sorts of things you might want to look at. So what do I mean by taxing pensions in payment?
Thank you.
Occupational pensions, most of the contributions come from the employer. There's no national insurance contributions on that at all. Then they're taken out as pensions. No national insurance contributions there. That's incredibly generous tax treatment. So you could find some way of getting more tax there. But it's always going to be the case that people in work, younger generations, are paying the big bulk of the tax and older generations are consuming. And of course, younger generations become older generations. So there is an intergenerational contract here, which is, it's important to kind of maintain and be clear. And I paid lots of tax during my working life. It's not unreasonable of me then to be able to get a pension and health care in my older age. But there might be some rebalancing there. I think the real issue about the intergenerational change is going back to what I said much earlier. Wages have just stopped increasing. So for the last 15 years, wages haven't increased. Over that period, asset prices have risen, and actually the incomes of older generations have gone up. Last 15 years for that is probably not right, particularly the last 25 years, that effect on asset prices and pensioner incomes has really shifted the balance between older and younger generations. And this isn't just a kind of question of one generation getting lucky and another not. There's a big long-term consequence of this, which is as the fraction of the wealth, household wealth, is much more important than it was. So it's twice as important as a fraction of national income as it was 25 years ago. The result is inheritance is twice as important as it was. The result is this concentration among a particular part of a particular generation will flow through to the next generation. And it's much more important now than it was 50 years ago who your parents are for your chances in life, because of inheritance as well as other issues around social mobility, because wealth has become more important relative to earnings. And this almost takes us back 100, 150 years to a world in which what really mattered was your family wealth.
It's a pretty stark one, isn't it? That sort of social regression, the phrase you use, much more important now than it was 50 years ago.
Yes. Yes, choose your parents well is the.
I hope everyone here did. We're going to come to the audience in about 5 minutes' time. We hope for better questions from you than certainly from me. Can I ask you a little bit about the role of the Institute of Fiscal Studies and how you see it? Because it has become the go-to for certainly broadcasters, and I work for one, and a lot of other people now as a sort of almost a truth-checking organisation. At the same time, we've seen criticism of establishment statistical bodies, let's put it like that. You have political enemies, clearly. When you are on the receiving end of criticism, do you feel free to respond? Do you find it difficult? Do you find it uncomfortable? Or are you always sure enough about your output and your interpretations to be able to say, well, look, this is the world as we understand it?
I think mostly the latter. I think we are, generally speaking, pretty lucky. We don't get an awful lot of unpleasantness and pushback, but there are times when we do. And partly we don't because we are even-handed and we have criticised pretty much everybody in terms of what they say politically. And I can honestly say that I've had, I think in the 14 years I've been director, I think I've had one complaint from the Conservatives and one complaint from Labour over all that time. That was clearly not the experience of my predecessor when Gordon Brown was Chancellor. But I think that reflects individual personalities. There have been difficult moments. I mean, the Brexit referendum and the Scottish referendum were both difficult because in both cases we are an economics institute. In both cases, the economics absolutely plain as day. Yeah. But that's not to say there aren't other very strong arguments on the other side, but because we were just talking about the economics, we came under some attack for appearing to be unbalanced. There were sometimes, frankly, when we had Jeremy Corbyn on the one hand, Liz Truss on the other, where we were fairly robust in saying what we thought to be the truth, and that caused some blowback from the true believers. But on the whole, I think we have the confidence that we need. I should say in this context, the IFAS is a small charity. We have no money. We have no right to exist. We are not in any sense associated with government or public sector. We exist entirely by applying for research funding on the basis of the quality of mostly the academic work that we do, and we only have a right to exist because of the quality and independence of what we do. And if we get that wrong, then we're gone. We're not one of these organizations with secure funding or a big foundation behind us or anything like that. So, we have to get it right, otherwise we're gone.
Right, on that note, let's hear from the audience. I'm going to take you in groups of 3 if we could. So there, and there, if we could. First of all, you, sir.
Thank you very much. You mentioned very briefly about the impacts of the car industry on UK economic growth. What do you feel the role of FDI and TNCs will be going forward for the UK's economic growth?
Thank you, sir. And gentleman, I think it was a gentleman here.
In 1997, Gordon Brown removed the tax credit on dividends for pensions. How has that affected the growth over the years?
Thank you very much indeed. And then it was the lady right at the back, I think with white sleeves or a cardigan. I won't go too deep into the sartorial. Madam.
Hi, we're mum and daughter here. We've got 2 questions. Mum's is, to whom do we owe the massive debt? And my question is, we don't hear that much about Brexit anymore. Do you think in the next decade there will be any economic benefit?
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you to all of you. Let's start. I think there was a car industry question. Paul.
I don't know a lot specifically about the car industry, but the question I think was broader and about foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment is really important to the UK economy. We do rely on it more, actually, than most economies. We know, actually, that foreign-owned companies in the UK tend to be the most productive, so they're really important for our productivity. And if you look at our productivity performance over the last 30 years, where it's been positive, it's been right at the top end, which is very often multinational companies reliant to a large degree on foreign direct investment. And going to part of the last question, we do know one of the consequences of what happened after 2016 is that foreign direct investment did fall and fall quite significantly after that. So the answer is really important. It did fall. Now, whether that was to do with Brexit or the political chaos that ensued, I think is a question we'll never be quite sure about. And I think one of the sort of just coming onto that sort of slightly more general issue, we had, when you think about the Brexit vote, 52-48, you also have to think about what would have happened if it had been 52-48 the other way. And what I don't think would have happened would have been, political nirvana and everyone saying, yes, that's fine, let's forget about it and get on with things. What I think we would have got is probably equal political chaos of one kind or another, and possibly quite a lot of the economic effects that we saw as a result of it.
Let's talk about, I think it was advanced corporation tax, the 97
Indeed, yes.
tax. Look at the man who smiles at the talk of advanced corporation tax.
Well, I'm impressed as the man who knew that was about advanced corporation tax. So, I mean, the issue here is that, broadly speaking, one of the tax advantages of saving in a pension was significantly reduced back in 1997. Since then, and some of this is coincidental, some of it may be causal, occupational pensions in the UK have essentially ceased to exist. Outside of the lucky people in probably the BBC, but certainly the rest of the public sector.
No comments at all about that.
Why have occupational pensions essentially ceased to exist? Well, partly death through kindness. I mean, they've been regulated to such a degree that it's been very difficult for companies to take on the risks associated. Partly the returns have gone down, of which a part of that is to do with the change in the tax that the gentleman was referring to. Partly because we've had a period of very low interest rates and increasing longevity, so the cost of these has become much greater. But the extraordinary thing about our occupational pension sector is that back in 1997, about 70% of their assets were invested in equities, which is exactly what you'd expect. These are long-lived institutions. They're sharing risk between generations, between employers and employees, exactly the sorts of institutions you'd expect would be able to share that risk and invest in equities. Today, 7% of their assets are inequities. The rest are in gilts mostly, and bonds. So, and that's, in my view, completely ludicrous for organisations of that kind and of negative value. I mean, it's a negative effect for the economy. The dividend tax change probably played a small role in that, but there were big other changes pushing us in that direction.
Thank you. To whom is all the money owed? I think I've got that about right.
So who owns UK gilts? Well, part of the answer I just gave you: pension funds. So a large chunk of UK government debt is held by pension funds. Another large chunk, and we're unusual internationally in this, by international investors. So we are, as the phrase goes, dependent on the kindness of strangers to fund our debt. And the third large chunk is held via the Bank of England, which owns them as a result of its quantitative easing programme. It's quite quickly, at the moment, selling those back into the market, into the institutional investors. One of the reasons, actually, that interest rates on gilts, on government debt, are going to remain a little higher for a little longer. So it's a combination of UK institutions like pension funds, foreign institutions, and the Bank of England, but the Bank of England's holdings are falling quite fast.
And the final question was Brexit. I think, again, to paraphrase, it was something along the lines of, when will we see the benefits of Brexit, or when will we get better off as a result of Brexit? Any of those?
Well, I think it's pretty clear that, as I say, the economics of Brexit are fairly straightforward. If you make trade with your biggest, nearest and richest trading partner more difficult and more expensive, that's not going to give you economic benefits. Now, it gives you other benefits. It gives you the potential to control your borders, for example. We haven't taken advantage of that to some extent, but it does allow you to do that. So there are political and sovereignty benefits. It does give you the ability to change some of your economic regulation and so on, but we decided not to do that because the more that you diverge from the rest of Europe, the more difficult trade becomes. So what have we seen? It's very hard to say what has been the impact on the size of the economy. The kind of consensus is that the economy in the long run will be maybe 4 or 5% smaller than it otherwise would have been. That's about £100 billion. But that, who knows? What you can see two things very, very clearly. One is that the number of small companies trading has collapsed because it's so much more difficult to trade. That much is absolutely clear. And the second thing, as I said earlier, is that certainly until recently, levels of investment in the UK have not tracked what has happened in other advanced economies. Now, whether that's Brexit itself or whether it's the political chaos we've been through for the last 7 or 8 years, it's quite difficult to disentangle. But are there even potentially economic benefits from Brexit? It's quite hard to see what they are.
I wanted to do a couple of linked questions that have come in from the audience online. The first is, do you think there's any possibility Labour could renegotiate trade with the EU? And I suppose they're taking into account Labour's own red lines. And the second is what you think of the likelihood of populist economics as Labour comes under pressure from reform and, their words of the question, a hostile media outlets. And I mean, you saw a very different set of economic assumptions from what we understood to be Reform's economic manifesto. First of all, about trade and the EU.
I think there's scope for very limited change. So there are negotiations going on about foodstuffs and veterinary things and so on. But the big thing here is will be re-entering the customs union. That's the thing that would make trade much easier. That's a red line for the government. They said they're absolutely not willing to do that, let alone re-entering the single market. There's also, of course, the other side of this. It's not at all clear it's in the interest of the European Union to offer us a great deal here. I mean, not least because they don't want to appear to reward a country that has moved outside of the EU. To my surprise, I have to say, our government has even rejected the overture to allow, for example, movement of young people between the EU and the UK. My guess is that there'll be some limited progress over the next 3 or 4 years in very specific areas, which are all quite important and involve long technical negotiations. Anything significant, at the earliest, will be for the Parliament after this, and possibly beyond that.
But at the moment, you can add it to your list of red lines, of third rails, rather.
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly, for understandable political reasons, it's just been ruled out as a serious option.
Let's talk about populist economics and the pressure from a resurgent reform. I have to admit, when the various times when I talked with reform candidates, I didn't understand what their very confident reasoning about how they would raise money and how they would spend money. I don't know if you did, and whether you think there is spillover from their ideas into the mainstream.
Well, let me take Reform and the Greens, if I may,
yes.
in that. I mean, particularly the Greens don't like it when I do that, but actually, I think if you're thinking about populist economics, you do need it, again, to be balanced. It's worth thinking about those two parties together, because in some ways, they presented similar and wholly impractical economic prospectuses. So what were reforms saying? I mean, broadly speaking, and I may get the details wrong, because this is from memory. Broadly speaking, they were saying, we can offer you huge tax cuts by essentially massively increasing the income tax allowance, and we'll pay for that in two broad ways. One is that we'll get something like 40 or 50 billion pounds from the Bank of England's quantitative easing or quantitative tightening program. They can't. I mean, you can maybe get 5 billion, essentially a tax. It's essentially a tax on the banks. Yeah. So you could get you could get some money possibly from that, but nothing in the order of what they said, and the rest from unspecified efficiency savings across the public sector of the order of 100 billion pounds. So nothing at all. So what if you took them at face value? They were looking at swinging cuts to public spending with absolutely no sense of what that would be. So but of course that wasn't what people were challenging them about, or what people were particularly interested in. But it sounds good. Big tax cuts, and we'll get it from the banks and from savings on
wasteful civil servants.
Exactly. And if you look at the Greens, so they had some tax rises in there, and they got quizzed quite a lot on their suggestions for a wealth tax, which they may or may not have been able to get I can't remember the numbers, 20, 30 billion or whatever they were saying from that. But what surprised me is they weren't quizzed on the big things that they were suggesting, one of which was something like 90 or 100 billion pounds from a carbon tax. Now, that would be an enormous carbon tax, and given they're the Greens, you can understand why they're doing that. But that would have a fundamental effect on society. It would massively increase the cost of energy, obviously, and food, and many imported goods. And that's fine, but then you probably need to spend most of that 100 billion pounds on compensating people through higher welfare payments, lower taxes, and so on. None of that was in the manifesto. And in addition, they were saying that they would increase borrowing by, I think, 80 billion pounds a year. So you've got massive, and what would they do with that? Massive increases in public spending, but not funded, because none of that is real money. So on both sides of politics, you've got these populist ideas that on the one side you can slash taxes and it won't really have an effect on public services because there's so much waste. On the other side, you can massively increase spending on public services without actually affecting people through higher taxes. And I think the two sides, obviously these are parties that are miles from government, but I think in each case, I think that sort of utopian thinking can infect the mainstream.
Do you think, when you look at various moments of what some might call economic madness, that populist economics has infected or has become part of the mainstream? I mean, some people would say the tax pledges are populist economics because they bind the hands of administrations in a way that no rational tax planner would ever want.
I think they're different. I mean, they are within the mainstream of politics, and they bind in a way that within even with those choices, we are in a world where we're spending, whatever is it, 40% of national income on public services. We're raising 37% from taxes. I mean, this is this is within the bounds of what you could make arguments for, and you could certainly make arguments for a smaller state if you can say how you would cut it. You can make arguments for a bigger state if you can say how you would raise the money. If you could say how you would raise the money. I think the issue is not so much populist economics; it's more politicians are scared of the electorate. I think that's in the end the truth of it. And as I said right at the beginning, I think the electorate is scared of politicians.
Let's go back to you, please, if we could.
Yeah, hi. On a day when the energy price cap's gone up again, could you maybe comment on how you think GB Energy is going to help things?
That's very handy. We also have a question from our online audience on GB Energy as well. We've got a gentleman here, and there was a gentleman there in the blue jumper as well. If we can get a microphone to him. Sorry, it's the most inconvenient place to get a microphone to. I see you've opted for the easy option of the front row. If we can get the microphone to that gentleman there as well. Sir, would you like to? Yeah, you're on.
Thank you.
Thank
Paul
you.
will remember when Ireland was bankrupt after the 2008-2009 crash, and Gordon Brown intervened in Europe to suggest that they could have 12.5% corporation tax. And 15 years later, Ireland have a surplus of revenue, which they almost don't know what to do with. Do you think there's any validity, as we all want growth, except for the Greens, that we all want growth, that Rachel could make corporation tax at the now accepted 15% on a long-term basis to try and get that direct inward investment you're talking about?
Thank you very much. And it was the gentleman there. Thank you, sir.
If the one of the big beasts in the room is the deficit, is there any validity, in your opinion, on any modern monetarist theory and the fact that deficits don't really matter if you can print your own income, print your own money?
Thank you very much indeed. Right, you start with the first one.
On Great British Energy, I'm afraid I really don't know, and I don't know whether that is more defined than it was, but certainly until recently there was very little sense of what it would actually be. So what will happen to energy bills over the next years? I'm going to answer a slightly different question because I really can't answer that question. Yeah. But first of all, price per unit electricity for a long period was clearly increased by the fact that we were spending lots of money on building windmills and solar farms and so on. Absolutely the right thing. Absolutely the right thing to do. That now looks particularly the right thing to do with other energy prices looking so high. Getting effective investment into renewable energies is clearly going to be incredibly important. And the long run effects should be to keep electricity prices down. But there is an enormous amount of additional investment that's going to be required to achieve that, because you don't just need to replace all of the electricity that we produce at the moment, and we're making good progress on that. Because we're going to have electric cars, and if we're replacing the gas boilers, even the heat pumps need some electricity, and a lot of manufacturing processes are going to move to electricity. I can't remember the numbers, but there is a vast amount of investment that's going to be required to achieve that. But I'm afraid I can't answer anything about GB Energy specifically.
I think the Irish example was the next question.
Yeah, the Irish example here is that they've had very low rates of corporation tax now for a protracted period of time. And that's been very, very effective at bringing in foreign investment. And I mean, the Irish economy is just extraordinary. You look back to the 1970s, this was a very, very poor country. It's now a richer country than the UK. And the gap between Northern Ireland and the Republic is just staggering in terms of income per head and so on. Now, that is down to a lot of changes, changes to their education system, changes to their political system, but certainly changes to their corporation tax system was very important in bringing in quite a lot of that foreign direct investment. So the question is, could we manage the same trick here? I think there are several big differences between the UK and Ireland. The first is when they introduced very low corporation tax. It cost them almost nothing because they had almost no profits at that time. So it was a sort of, whereas if we were to cut corporation tax now to 15%, it would cost us a lot of money in the short run. So there's a big difference there because we've obviously already got large amounts of inward investment. Secondly, they've got a first mover thing there. A lot of the investment that might have come to the UK has already gone to Ireland. And thirdly, we've sort of been there. I mean, the last government spent a large amount of money and a lot of time bringing the rate of corporation tax down to 19%, and then pushed it straight back up to 25%, which is, I'm afraid, rather typical of tax policy, which is no government seems to know what it's doing from one moment to the next. What is the evidence on this? The evidence it clearly does have some effect on inward investment. Would it pay for itself fiscally? Well, certainly not in the next 10 years, but it's difficult to know over a longer period. It's one of those things you might have it's a rational bet, but it will be a bet, and I wouldn't know which way to put my money, if I'm honest on that.
The third question was about deficits and modern monetarist theory. And
monetary theory.
Not monetarist,
not
forgive me.
Very different thing.
Different age. The idea that we could perhaps ignore the looming deficit.
Yeah, so modern monetary theory essentially takes the idea that if a government with a sovereign currency can print its own currency, then it doesn't have real constraints unless inflation looms, and that's often then pushed to other ideas which take you to the idea there aren't constraints. And I think it's either sort of it either doesn't mean anything very different to normal economics in the sense that, yes, we all understand there are constraints, and you can think of the constraint being the inflationary constraint, or you can think of the constraint being the deficit constraint. But clearly, if we were to, print a whole bunch of money now and fund lots of public spending on it, that would be inflationary, and you do have to pay that debt back, or it's used, to go back to an earlier question, as essentially a sense of populist economics, which says just there aren't any constraints. Well, of course there are constraints. Money supply matters, but you can't magic things into being just by magicking money into being. That's not how economics works. Economics works through real stuff where money, as it were, helps oil the wheels, and you don't want too much of it and you don't want too little of it, because if you have the wrong amount of money, things go wrong. But simply saying you can have as much money as you like and suddenly you've got the economic capacity to do whatever you like it's clearly snake oil.
I think that's a no. It's difficult to tell.
Yeah, so you mentioned fiscal rules and how Rachel Reeves was looking at changing public sector net debt to kind of evaluate how debt is valued. And fiscal rules, they're often called that they're short term, they change a lot, and they de-incentivize investment. So what do you think needs to kind of change to fiscal rules so that they incentivize investment and they're more long term?
Fabulous, thank you. Madam?
We know that policies by the government disproportionately affect those underrepresented at the ballot, and we saw this especially with the austerity cuts, where non-voters showed nearly double the cost that voters did. With Keir Starmer warning that it will be what he calls a harsh winter, to what extent can we expect the October budget to be regressive?
Excellent. Thank you very much. And sir, we'll just get a microphone to the gentleman there. He's in a blue shirt and I think a jacket or a cardigan. That's coming to you now. Thank you very much.
Firstly, many thanks to Paul. As a former political correspondent, your consistent analysis on Johnny and other Radio 4 programmes has been brilliant, even if at the end of it you feel deeply depressed about the systemic and structural problems facing the UK. Reference to Ireland, I would advise everybody to look up some Irish websites, because today was budget day in Ireland. Despite huge planning problems with infrastructure, huge housing crisis, big waiting lists in hospitals, it's given away billions today because it's been a successful economy run consistently well for a long time.
Okay, I'm going to press you for a question for Paul.
The question is, basically, you're asked about corporation tax. Are there other lessons that we can learn from other mainstream successful European economies not including Germany on this occasion, because that seems to be in trouble as well.
Thank you very much indeed. We're going to have to crack through this, I'm afraid. It's lucky they're just small topics like fiscal rules and other lessons. Let's start with the fiscal rules.
So fiscal rules are self-imposed limits that governments put on themselves in terms of their debt and borrowing, and actually ours have turned over more quickly than fiscal rules in any other country. They're very unstable. So there's nothing God-given about keeping to any particular fiscal rule. I mean, broadly, what you need from your fiscal policy is something that is sustainable over the long run. In other words, isn't going to lead to debt moving ever upwards. Our problem is that we are very close to a world where debt is moving ever upwards, and our current fiscal rule that debt should be falling between the fourth and fifth year of the forecast period is a very silly rule, because it allows debt to go like that and then come down like that, and that's fine under that rule. So it's not a very sensible rule. The reason we have these rules is, first, so that the markets, the electorate, have got some idea what the government's trying to achieve, and to give some sense of fiscal sustainability. Secondly, so the Treasury can control other ministers. If there's a limit, then you've got to say, well, if you have that, then I have to put taxes up or take money from over there. If politicians were trustworthy over long periods of time, you wouldn't need these. You would just put policies in place which achieved that sustainability over long periods. But I'm afraid we're not necessarily in that world. The trouble with the rules as they're currently, people who want to change the rules in order to get more spending, this rule is pretty loose as it stands. It's the loosest we've ever effectively had. That said, I don't think anyone's going to really complain if they move from, I'm going to be boring, current measure is public sector net debt excluding the Bank of England. If you just move to public sector net debt, that gives you a little bit more headroom. I don't think that's not going to spook the markets. It gives you more money for investment spending. But in the end, if we want more spending, particularly on current public services, day-to-day spending, we have to swallow it and say, in the end, you have to pay tax, because, to repeat what I said right at the beginning, one of our problems at the moment is we're spending so much on debt interest, we don't have money for anything else.
The lady asked, I think, a reference again to the intergenerational equality question, rather a glancing one, but about voting and not voting, and the way the burden falls perhaps on those who don't get to the ballot box.
Well, and ended, I think, with a question about whether I expect the budget to be regressive. I mean, I'd be very surprised if it is, given the noises that we've heard about this being something that impacts will fall most heavily on those with the broadest shoulders. I mean, if you look over the 2010s, there's certainly a lot of truth in what you were saying. I mean, working age welfare benefits were cut really significantly over that period. And who are the people least likely to vote? They're poor working age people on benefits. Clearly, the impact on young people was particularly significant. They're also relatively unlikely to vote. And pensioners, broadly speaking, at least with the pension system, were protected through the triple lock. Though it is important to say that taxes on pensioners have gone up quite a lot more than taxes on working age people. If you're a pensioner on average pensioning on average sorts of incomes, your tax burden has gone up a lot more than if you're a working age person on average sorts of incomes, because of what's happened to national insurance and indeed to the tax allowance. So we'll wait and see what's in the budget. I'd be very surprised, given what we've heard, if it turns out to be something that is regressive, but we will see.
And the last one was about lessons from other economies. I mean, I guess we could ask you for, is there a shining lesson, one that springs to mind when it comes to the way in which other economies run their public finances?
I think there are definitely lessons in terms of the sort of method, as it were. No other country has this kind of ludicrous, we have this great big budget twice a year where, loads and loads and loads of things are put into the Chancellor's box. It's all done without any serious consultation. And you get a whole new set of tax policies sprung on the world, and lots of headlines. Most countries just make policy like that in a slightly more rational way. So I'm going to give three sort of meta things rather than specific. Secondly, we are, as is I think well known, pretty much the most centralised state in England at least. And so most other countries, more serious decision making is devolved to more serious regional levels of government, which both allows a degree of plurality and a degree of trying things out and spreads political power. And thirdly, a very kind of meta kind of point is, I think there's at least some evidence that a better designed electoral system has an effect on the quality of economic policy making, where you have to take more people along with you so that you don't chuck everything up in the air and change it every 5 minutes, which happens both within parties and between parties here, and happens much less in some other countries which have different sorts of electoral politics.
Thank you very much. We're going to have to call a halt there. I want to thank Paul Johnson, first of all, for giving us his time, his experience, and his knowledge. It's always a pleasure to have him on. He packs so much into every answer and so much balance and consideration. So, Paul, thank you very much. Thank you to you as well. Indeed. Thank you to you here. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry if we didn't get a chance to come to all of you. Thank you to the audience we have online. Final thanks to Intelligence Squared and Guinness Global Investors who have made this happen. Thank you for coming along and have a very good night. Thanks very much. Thanks, Paul. A real pleasure. Real pleasure. Thank you.